My microphone up. If I could have your attention, I know we're finishing up lunch. If we could put down our cellular devices. I read an article. Anybody see the big Apple announcement yesterday, or at least hear news about it? So there's these new phones. I heard the phones are even bigger. So, and the headline I read in the paper is that they want them to be so big that we have to use two hands so that we can't do anything else and never put them down, as if it weren't bad enough already. So what I want to talk about now in this section of the training is care for the caregiver. This is when we organize a system within an organization to provide peer-based emotional first aid to one another. So the idea is, and research clearly shows, that people who are involved either directly or closely indirectly with harmful events in health systems are themselves traumatized by these events. They're traumatized by having harmed patients that they were trying to help. They're traumatized by being sued. They're traumatized by thoughts of losing their job. They're traumatized by the suffering that they've caused. They're traumatized in a whole number of ways, and to a variety of different degrees, depending on the severity of the event, depending on their own personal history. But we know that being in proximity to these bad outcomes is really damaging to health professionals. And we know it's not always errors or mistakes that traumatize people. Occasionally in some of these trainings, Tim and I have asked tables to just sit and talk to one another about events in their, these are all experienced health professionals like yourselves. You just ask them to sit and talk about events that happened in their careers as health professionals that traumatized them that they never got support for. And if you want a kind of traumatizing thing, you do that, because a room full of health professionals has seen a lot of bad things happen. Traumatizing things, and often they haven't got any support for them. And one of the most moving things that I witness in those situations is that people often tell stories from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, from 30 years ago that are still completely alive inside of them, these things that they've witnessed. So the purpose of a Care for the Caregiver program is to try not to perpetuate that kind of harm in the future. From this day forward, or from the time we organize a Care for the Caregiver program in your system, forward into the future, we don't want people to be harmed in that way. Bad things are going to happen. Traumatic experiences, you're going to witness violence, you're going to witness sudden death, you're going to witness all mistakes with terrible consequences. So we can't prevent the sort of primary trauma of being a health professional that witnesses difficult, painful things. But going through that and not getting any support, we can prevent. It's similar to the way Tim and I think about the Candor response to errors, which is we have not yet figured out, as health professionals and safety researchers and so on, how to make healthcare completely safe. If we could, we would. This is the preferred option, never to hurt anyone again, but we haven't figured out how to do that despite our ongoing efforts. So people continue to get hurt, but we have figured out how not to pour salt in the wound. We have figured out how not to re-traumatize patients who have already been hurt. And that's by telling them the truth, by having fair compensation, by being transparent, by talking to patients and families soon after the event. This is how we avoid going from bad to worse, adding insult to injury. Analogously, when providers are traumatized by witnessing these things, we can also prevent the wound from being worse. And we do that by providing emotional first aid. So that's what this section is about. This falls into the response and communication component of Candor, but whereas I think Candor programs are best known for telling the truth to patients and families, this is from my point of view, Tim's and our teams, this is equally important. In fact, in our experience, when we go into organizations, it's even more important than talking to patients and families. Often organizations, when we ask them, would you like us to come and do some Candor training, they say, yes, do the Care for the Caregiver thing first. That's what they want most. That's what they feel the most palpable need for. So that's where this falls. This is response and communication with your colleagues and peers, not with patients and families. So there's this term, second victims, which I'm not crazy about. We still haven't found another alternative for it. The affected providers, we'd like to just call this program care for the caregiver. But the term that's frequently used in the literature is a second victim. The idea is that the patient is the primary victim and that the other victims are the people who were involved in the event but were in some way not to blame but are being affected by it anyway. So there's a literature about health professionals who witness these bad outcomes, and we've learned some things. So we've learned, first of all, that people get both formal and informal emotional support. The informal support that people get is what you can probably think of that happens on your floor or in your clinic when something bad happens. That is, the nurse manager comes and checks you out, your close friend, the person in the other unit who you're friends with, they come and sort of look after you on an informal basis. But it's unreliable. It doesn't always happen. If you're someone who's new to the team or who the nurse manager doesn't get along with, you may or may not get that support. There's also formal kinds of support, the most frequent of which is EAP sorts of programs, employee assistance programs, the formal kinds of counseling, drug abuse and addiction treatment that most large organizations will provide for their employees. We want something other than this. We want Care for the Caregiver is a formal mechanism of support that falls short of EAP and professional counseling. And it's more reliable than the informal support that you might just get from other members of your team. We think that this should happen promptly, just like it does with patients and families. I think it's important to connect with the affected providers soon after the event so they don't fall into a pit of despair or start to engage in self-destructive behavior. We want to talk to them quickly if we can. We'd like to be able to create an opportunity for a timeout from clinical encounters. And going around the country, Tim and I have heard about a lot of different ways of thinking about and approaching this. Tim talks about this, the auto pause that some organizations have managed to do, where they actually have a systematic way of taking a provider who's been involved in a traumatic event and relieving them of their responsibilities for some temporary period of time. It may be a day, maybe a couple of days. And you might think to yourself, well, we're a critical access hospital. We can't give people time off when bad things happen. There's nobody else to backfill and do the work. The one creative solution we heard about, which granted I think was in a larger organization they took, was the dues from the medical staff, Tim. And they either increase them slightly or just simply set aside a portion of the dues to the medical staff to put in a pool of money that would pay locums or temporary staff so that you could have a mechanism for backfilling so that you could give people some time off when they needed it. So we're realistic, and we recognize that it's not a trivial thing to take people off the line when they've been traumatized. We have a colleague who we used to bring around with us who's a firefighter, and they talk about that it's automatic. He's a Chicago firefighter, and when they have a bad event, when children die in a fire or something like that, a chief or a commander will come around and just take a bunch of those guys from the squad off and say, you're off for 48 hours, you're off for 72 hours. And the fire department is such that they can bring other staff in. In a hospital, you probably don't have a mechanism to do that yet, but you probably ought to think about developing one. Providers may need help communicating with patients and families. You saw Heather in that first video talk about how she wished she could have gone and talked to the family of that woman who had a cardiac arrest after being discharged from the ED. Had a Care for the Caregiver program been in place, there might have been an opportunity to do that. The providers also want information about what's going to happen in terms of the inquisition, right? Providers are smart people. They know if a really bad outcome has happened and they were involved, there is eventually going to be a cognitive interview. And it may not be as nice as the one Clay did, right? There's going to be someone who's going to come and talk to them. And they're very, very concerned. Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to lose my license? Am I going to get sued? What's going to happen? So they need someone to walk them and hold their hand through that process. And what providers tell us is that they really, really want to remain a trusted member of the team. One of their deepest fears that they've shared with us is that once they've made a big mistake or been present at a really bad outcome where there was some responsibility of the team, they feel like their colleagues might not trust them anymore, that they're no longer a trusted member of the team. And health professionals their work is so much a central part of their identity that losing this idea that they're a trusted member of the team is really, really damaging and really, really frightening, the prospect that my colleagues might look at me differently. And I think Tim could echo this, I don't know, but the experience I have is that most of the times their colleagues don't see them any differently, that they have enough understanding that things go wrong, that they are still accepting of them, but the person who it's happened to feels that very deeply, feels that they might not be seen the same way anymore. So these are the sorts of common things that we want to take care of when we do a Care for the Caregiver program. So how do we do it? All the things that you've learned about empathy in the previous 3 trainings you should bring to bear. This is a situation that primarily demands empathy. This is not an opportunity to explain anything. This is not an opportunity to ask or investigate anything. This is an opportunity to open up a space where your colleague can talk about what they're feeling. We know you're not therapists. We don't expect you to be therapists. If they are in such distress that they need professional help, you as a member of the Care for the Caregiver team should know how to refer them to professional help. And EAP is normally the next step. So if they talk about being actively suicidal or being in so much distress that you can't handle it with ordinary empathy, then you have to help them get the professional help that they need, and there should be mechanisms in place to do that. But for many, many situations, probably the vast majority, what they want is a sympathetic ear, right? Like a friend at work, a colleague who will listen to them. And these are some of the things that you want to be able to do. So first of all, go into these situations with this attitude of curiosity, solidarity, and support. So curiosity about what they're feeling, about what they're experiencing, about what they're going through. Do not assume you know anything about what they're experiencing. Just go in there with a completely open mind. The goal isn't to tell them anything, and the goal isn't to make them feel anything, okay? So sometimes we think comforting is about making somebody feel better, like they're children, right? But our colleagues aren't children. Our colleagues are full-grown adults. They're going to feel what they feel. It's not our job to make them feel better. So let go of that as a goal, and instead replace it with the goal of finding out what they do feel and being accepting of what they do feel and being present for what they do feel instead of making them feel some other way. So that's what the curiosity will do for you. Solidarity. I'm in this with you, because we think these events can be very isolating. And so we want to make our colleagues feel like they're not alone. We had this, the greatest example of this we've ever seen is we had somebody come up and volunteer to do one of these interactions, and it was a nurse who had made a mistake, and there was another nurse who came up to support her. And the nurse supporting her, the nurse who made the mistake said, I'm going to get fired. I know I'm going to get fired. They're going to fire me for this. And it was a pretty innocent mistake. And the guy just said, he said, you're not going to get fired. And she said, how do you know? Can you promise me I won't get fired? He said, well, no. But I'll tell you what, if you get fired, I'll walk out with you. So this is this beautiful, expression of solidarity, that I'm in it with you. And we want to do that because we want to make people feel that they're not alone. And support, I'm here to help you. I want to help. Acknowledge and name their emotional states. So you might think, I'm not good at empathy, people don't come to me, I'm not that warm, this isn't my greatest skill. Empathy is a learnable skill, and one of the things you can learn to do is simply, like Sherlock Holmes, you're trying to solve a mystery. And the mystery is, what are they feeling? So you gather all the evidence you can, their posture, their gesture, their facial expression, their tone of voice, everything you know about how they normally behave, their eye contact, the volume and pitch and rate of their speech, all that you take together and make inferences about what they're feeling. And then you name their feelings, okay? In our case, our actors, we tell them to emote a lot, okay? Our actors are not hiding their feelings. So they should be exhibiting some obviously emotional behavior. Your job is to name those feelings. It's one of the simplest empathy skills, which you ought to be able to master. So whoever comes up here, I want to see you trying to name feelings, okay? Please. Try to name feelings. I can't tell you how many times we tell people to name feelings and they come up here and they don't even try to name any feelings. So try to name some feelings. Maybe you're anxious that you'll get them wrong. It's possible you will. Feelings are invisible, right? We have to infer them from behavior. So we say, you seem really frustrated, or you seem really frightened. And they might tell you, no, I'm not frightened. I'm pissed off that nobody else helped me in the OR that day. Who knows what they might be feeling? So you can, but if you take a guess, they'll open up a little bit more. Express empathy and regret about the bad outcome. I'm just really so sorry. I heard about what happened in the operating room. What a terrible thing that was. So just express empathy. Acknowledge that a strong emotional reaction is normal. So we're trying to open up a space for them to have their feelings. And it's true especially for men that we're not allowed to express our feelings. It's thought to be weak. It's thought to be not masculine. But for women as well, especially in the health professions, there's a kind of toughness that we're supposed to display about being able to take anything, about being able to having seen everything, and that this doesn't affect us. But we're just human. When we see terrible things happen, of course it affects us. So we can create a space for people to have whatever feelings they're having. Invite elaboration of their thoughts and feelings. So part of empathy is not just naming people's feelings or being present and supporting them, but emotions are complicated, especially in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic situation. We don't actually know exactly what we're feeling. Right? Have you ever had a situation where you're confused about your own feelings? You know, I do all the time. I have to sort of sit and think, what is this feeling in the pit of my stomach? It feels terrible, but what is it? Is it sadness? Is it anxiety? Is it fear? People don't know. And one of the things that is so nice of talking with a friend is that we can talk about it, and after talking about it, then we can kind of put our finger on it more. So one of the gifts you can give people with empathy is to allow them to elaborate on their feelings so they know what they're feeling. The end result is that they have a better picture at the end of the interaction of what they're actually experiencing. And one of the ways we can do this is to paraphrase what they're feeling. So they're going to tell you what they feel or what they've been through, and we just basically repeat it back to them. Not in the same words, that's going to sound weird, but in a paraphrase, so that they know that we've been listening. And it gets a possibility for them to say, no, that's not exactly right. Either you didn't hear it right, or when they hear you summarize it back to them, it doesn't sound right to them. Like it's not exactly how they feel. So paraphrasing is very powerful. And finally, we can acknowledge the limits of language. That is, sometimes there's not much we can say. You know, what's happened is really terrible. You know, if you've, we've heard some incredibly traumatic stories of what people have witnessed. And sometimes there's not much you can say. And in that case, you know, in the Brene Brown video, she says, one of the cartoon animals says to the other, you know, I don't even know what to say. I'm just glad you told me. Well, that's a nice thing to say. Because there's an illusion, especially among health professionals who are so good at fixing things and who have this bias towards action. There's the illusion that I can say something that will fix it. But just think of yourself when you've been in great distress. There's nothing anyone can say that will fix it. You have a deep sense that it's going to take time until I feel better. Right? The circumstances will have to change. I'm going to have to mourn this loss. I'm going to have to. So nothing anyone can say can just make it go away. So let go of that goal of making it go away, of fixing it. And instead have the goal of being present, of identifying it. In fact, I think a lot of people have a fear of wallowing in emotions. I don't want to wallow in it, right? Or I don't want to let them wallow in it. I don't want to let too much emotion out. It might carry them away. I think it's really our fear. It might carry me away. It might make me feel my emotion. But I think the object is to wallow in it. Not in a negative sense of perseverating forever on a negative feeling, but in the sense of being with the feeling in the here and now, as long as it takes, as much as it takes, not denying any of the feelings. So, we want to now pursue a care for the caregiver interaction. In some ways, Clay has given us great foreshadowing of this because he sort of pursued care for the caregiver type goals when he went and did a cognitive interview and showed a lot of excellent skill in doing so. So we want to do a lot of what Clay did in this next interaction. We are going to bring in, which member of the team? Is it Tim? It's going to be the surgeon again, but instead of interviewing Dr. Phillips for details about what happened, we're now going to provide peer-based emotional support for Dr. Phillips. So Dr. Phillips has been present during a traumatic situation, a fire in the OR that significantly harmed the patient. He is affected by this in a way, and you are a member of the Care for the Caregiver team at your hospital. Dr. Phillips knows this is a scheduled thing. Care for the Caregiver is a programmatic, systematic response. So Dr. Phillips will have been contacted probably by the Care for the Caregiver team, said, you know, let's find a time where we can meet for coffee. I'm a member of the Care for the Caregiver team. We talk to everyone who's involved in these sorts of events, and I want to just check in with you to see if you're doing okay. So it's a scheduled thing. They probably don't know you intimately, but they're acquainted with you. It takes place in a private office. Tim?
It's 12 hours after the fire, and the patient has not yet had the burr hole put in. Other important pieces of fact for you all to know.
Is there anything else we should know, Tim, about time or place? It's like probably in his office or in the Care for the Caregiver person's office, something like that.
Yeah, it's in a private office.
Yeah.
The other piece you can assume is he knows all the information we talked about before lunch. So now he knows about the different size applicators. He's learned a little bit about the rep related to that piece of it. He's really learned a lot in the last 12 to 16 hours as people really dive into what happened.
So he has a full understanding of the event now, and you're going to go and provide peer support. So let's remember what we're not doing. Not doing any more investigation, no evaluation. This is emotional first aid for Dr. Phillips, who's been traumatized by this event. Okay, questions about the facts, about what your role is? Okay, so we'd like
Marty. Has one.
Grab my glass.
Yeah,
So, Bruce, you and Tim were adamant in the communication with the family about, don't say I know how you feel.
Right.
Here, in this situation, it might be comforting to know that you're talking to somebody who's been through something similar.
It's tempting. This is, I think, a real challenge with this one, because if you're being talked to by a real peer, then they have likely experienced something akin to what you've been through. If not another fire in the OR, another very bad outcome, unexpected bad outcome in the OR they've experienced. So the question is, how do you bring that up? I don't think that we have a uniform right answer for that. I think my general advice is, if you're the peer supporter, don't make it about you. That's the main caution I want to give you. Don't make it about you. If you think it might be comforting to them to hear you talk about your experience so they know you can identify with them, then I think it's okay. But you want to turn the conversation back to them. Tim, did you want to elaborate on that?
And you definitely don't want to one-up them to say, wow, I know it's hard for you, but let me tell you my story. At least. No, at least
this is
it did, because this is what happened to me.
This is a bad case. Doesn't compare at all
for you, but it really sucked for me.
Yeah.
So don't do that.
We've seen this work. We've seen people talk about how they've been through something similar, and we've seen it be effective. But remember your main goal. It isn't for you to tell war stories or anything like that. So if they ask, and sometimes, Andy's played this part before, sometimes he does ask, has something like this ever happened to you? It's okay to say yes or no. But the main thing, you don't lose sight of the goal, which is to continue to let it be about their experience, what they're feeling, what they need, how you can help them, and so on and so forth. Any other questions about how to handle this? Yes?
Is the expectation that he's going to do the surgery?
Is the expectation that he's going to do the surgery? I think, I don't know exactly how to answer. I know the facts. In real fact, he did. But what should we just continue with the facts of the case as it actually happened?
I would adopt a stance of curiosity, solidarity, and support.
Yeah. So that we just don't know.
Yeah. Yep.
So I guess that means you could ask him, are you planning to go ahead with the case? Just assume you don't know. And
Yep.
and if he says he is going to go ahead with the case, that's an interesting thing to talk about, isn't it?
Yep.
And how he feels about going back into the OR.
Yeah. That's why.
Other questions?
No, I told him.
Okay, go ahead and huddle up with your tables and think about who's going to volunteer. We'll only need one volunteer. Okay, we are about ready to get started again. It looks like Tim has stepped out of the room. I'd like him to be here when we get started, but we need a volunteer. Is there someone who would like to practice providing peer support? This is such a useful skill. You will be so appreciated by your colleagues if you learn to do this better. Maybe you already do this well. Do we have a volunteer? Nobody gets to go home tonight unless we get a volunteer. Tim cannot volunteer. We're looking for a volunteer, Tim.
Okay. We'll find one.
I think so too.
Always have Clay do it again. He was amazing.
I mean, in a perfect world, this is a surgeon, you know, we'd probably like another physician, but I think we have a limited number of physicians in the room, and I think they may have both already volunteered. There's at least one other physician.
I did this exact same scenario on the first
Oh, you did it, okay.
You did awesome.
So I think unless there's a hidden physician that I haven't identified yet, we may have to go with a non-physician for this role, and they'll have to act like a different kind of peer supporter. Still waiting for a volunteer. I know it takes time for the courage to build up. Now's a good time to volunteer one of your colleagues. Oh, I'm sure Rachel would be great, but I think that we minimize the learning if someone does it again that hasn't done it yet. Someone really ought to take an opportunity to try it. No, Rachel's not going to bail us out. At least not yet. Is there someone else that'd like to give it a try? I know you're feeling a little anxious about trying it, but it'll be great. All right, thank you so much. Can we black out the slides, please?
So thank you for trying. Okay, I am not a physician.
That's okay.
I am not an RN.
What do you do?
I am the quality director.
Okay,
at
great.
Waverly. So my background is biology and biotech before healthcare.
Perfect for this. Perfect.
Right, so forgive me. So
It's okay. So can you just introduce yourself in real life?
Sorry, Iris Varing, Director of Quality at Waverly Health
Iris, could you
Center.
come on up so we get it on
yes.
videotape and stuff also?
Great.
So go ahead one more time, introduce yourself.
Sure, on stage. Iris Varing, Waverly Health Center Director of Quality.
Great. And what role will you play in this interaction?
Well, we talked in our table about the ideal person being a fellow physician.
Yeah.
But I am not a fellow physician, and I can't act like one either.
So do you want to play someone like yourself?
I think I'd like to try and
Okay.
play my role. That way
Yeah.
I could get the feedback from you folks on maybe
I think
if I have to do this.
Absolutely. I don't think it's that unusual that you might have to do something like this. Especially if you're in a small system, it won't always be possible to have a peer. You might have only one OB in your system, and there's no other OB to talk to them. So whenever you're ready, please.
Okay.
The physician's name is still Paul Phillips.
Paul Phillips.
Okay, whenever you're ready,
All
please
right.
begin.
Dr. Phillips. Hello. Iris Varing, Director of
Iris.
Quality. I know we've met before.
Yeah.
I wanted to check in with you today and see how you were doing. How are you? May I ask?
Yeah. Okay.
Doing okay?
Mm-hmm.
What does okay mean? No, that's a loaded question, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I mean, still just trying to come to terms with what happened yesterday. Still, it's not all clear in my
Yeah.
head yet, but getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How's your schedule been since yesterday? Have you been seeing other patients? Have you
I've
been?
seen a few, yeah.
Have you? Okay. What does it look like today?
It's relatively busy. I think I meant to see Mr. Phillips.
Okay.
Sorry, Mr. Stevens later.
Okay.
But yeah, so
Okay.
still working.
So, would I be able to suggest that we perhaps clear your schedule for today, just to give you a little break, downtime to process what happened? I'll work with our CMO and administration to do that. We'll make sure we get the folks back on your schedule. And that way we can take some time for you to maybe get squared up. And
Sure. I mean,
is that okay?
yeah. I mean,
Okay.
does it seem like I'm not able to work, or?
I think you'd be able to work. I just want to care for you a little bit and make sure you are all right for you. I have no doubt that you would care for patients exceptionally. I know you're trained for these types of things, but I just want to maybe take a little bit of time for you.
Yeah.
So I'm very confident in you. I just want to do this for you, if that's okay, with your permission, of course.
Yeah, no, I understand. I mean,
Okay.
I'm slightly skeptical about whether I should see Mr. Stevens again,
Sure.
to be honest with you. But
Sure.
but other patients, I feel would be fine. But if
Okay.
if that's the direction that you want to take, then
Sure.
I'll respect that.
Well, let's think about that for a second. I know you mentioned you're slightly skeptical about seeing the patient again, Mr. Phillips. Tell me about that. Why do you feel that way?
Well, I haven't spoken to the family yet. and
Okay.
With what went on yesterday, I just don't know if it'd be the best idea, I suppose.
Sure. And why? Why are you thinking that?
I don't know. I think that it's just a messy situation right now, and I don't want to make it any messier by
Sure.
stepping
Yeah.
into it again.
I think in these situations we learn as we go, and we kind of make it up as we go along. I use that term somewhat in jest, but in reality. And I think we can talk about going through this case with them. I think the family would welcome some interaction from you and some discussion with you. And with your comfort level and your permission, we can help work through that and let you sit down with them and talk with them. I think if you think it might help, let's try that. But if you're worried about it, we don't have to. But that's something we can think about and maybe come back to that later.
It makes me a little bit nervous. I
Yeah,
thought this was meant to be
of
making me more comfortable this session.
Sure.
But that
Yeah.
makes me a little bit more scared, to be honest with you. But no,
course.
I understand that that's something I should do.
I can understand your fear. I can only imagine your fear. I am, as you know, I'm not a surgeon. And the fear, I got to think, is normal. And my thought is we can help you work through that. I would imagine the fear, perhaps some angst about what they might be feeling. We have talked with them already, and we can walk through with you what we feel we've received from them. They have questions, they're worried, and that's normal as well. I wonder that you might be able to help each other in that regard. I think they want to hear from us as much as we can, but we want to make sure that that's a comfortable conversation for you too, and we'll help you through that. And if you feel that you don't want to, we'll work through that as well.
Okay.
Okay. You talked about caring for Mr. Phillips as well. Not sure you want to proceed. So my understanding is that the borehole has not been done yet, correct?
No, it's not been.
And what is the situation there? Do you know?
It needs
Can
to
you
be
share
done.
with me? Needs to be done?
yeah,
What's
yeah,
the
definitely.
time frame on that?
Yeah, it needs to be done today for sure.
Okay.
But,
And your thoughts on what you want to do there?
yeah, as I said, he is one patient. I wouldn't. I'm not sure that I should follow
Okay.
through with that procedure.
Okay. Then we'll make arrangements for someone else to do that. Is that okay with you?
Yep.
Okay. So in saying that, I want you to make sure that you know this is not a failure on you to not feel confident in going back to this patient. I think that's totally understandable and totally okay. So don't let that mess with your confidence, and it's part of the healing is what I would understand
No, I
and
know.
venture to say.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you be comfortable crossing over the patient's care to the next provider who does the borehole? Giving a history of
Yeah, it's
what
just
happened
there's
and-
definitely feelings associated with that just now, so I think that
Okay.
would probably be I just feel very guilty, but
So you mentioned guilty in terms of
just I think that just I haven't used so much of that Youre prep. I feel like
yeah,
I just didn't read. Now after the fact, I've gone back and read the label, and it's quite
Sure.
clearly states don't use in the head and the neck, and
yeah.
yeah.
And you realize that 99.9% of events happen due to process issues, and
Well, I'm telling. I mean, to be quite honest, I'm absolutely seething that we don't actually have the right
Yeah.
size applicator in the
Right.
OR. I mean, I think that's just critical,
Yeah.
and I think
Yeah.
it's just mad as hell at that Youre
Yeah.
prep rep for not having provided us with something. to be honest with you.
Understandable,
I
yeah.
think that I know I share some of the blame and the burden here,
Right.
but I think, like you say, you've hit the nail on the head. The process. I mean, I think
yeah,
I've got to really look at some of that stuff.
absolutely. And the process is on us.
Mm-hmm.
Really, we need to look at all of that, and you were set up to that failure, and so for that reason, don't take the entire blame on that. That's a process issue. That's a learning we take from this, and we own it. Yeah, and an opportunity to make that all better.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What else are your thoughts?
Don't know.
We have peer support in employee assistance programs, and we also have a support program through our insurance carrier. With your permission, may I share some of that information with you in case you'd like to reach out to someone?
Sure. I mean, everyone has. I mean, I have to be honest. Everyone has been extremely supportive so far.
Great.
I really have found that to be very comforting. Actually, everyone here has been really excellent.
Good. We want to hear that. And we want to be here for you as well. And there's no obligation to use it. I'll get you the information. It's completely confidential. There for you to use. Be patient with yourself and use that resource as you need to. And of course, I am here as well, and I will continue to reach out to you in intervals. And with your permission, maybe I'll reach out to you every week or so and just see how you're doing.
Sure.
And with your schedule, we'll give you today, and we'll connect with you as well. And I'd like to keep you posted on the family. I'm not sure if I don't want to bombard you with that, but you
Yeah.
mentioned earlier about them, so thinking you might want to know some of that info, we'll keep you posted on that and help work through maybe that connection with them. But think about that
Okay.
for a little bit, and we can revisit that.
Okay. Thank you.
And what else can I
Stop right
do
there.
for
Wow.
you?
What's your first name again? Iris. Sweating Iris?
Kind of.
Yeah. You did great. Thank you so much for volunteering. We really, really appreciate it. As I was sitting down, I just thought, what a generous, selfless thing it is to volunteer. So let's give her a big round of applause just for doing so. You put yourself on the spot in order to learn, but also in order to help your colleagues. So we're really grateful. Can you tell us about what the huddle was like at your table and how you conceptualized your goals and so on?
Well, yeah, the huddle was about having a provider, a peer, a true peer who might be able to share some experiences that they may have had and some of the feelings and emotions that they may have experienced over their course of the career. And so that was a lot of our discussion, I think, and about how to give the support in a very empathetic way.
And what did you conclude? Like, what was that discussion like?
Well, to me, it was kind of starting off open-ended, like, how are you doing? And I kept thinking about what you had mentioned earlier about trying to identify maybe emotions, not trying to assign emotions, but more identify them and reiterate in a supportive way.
I think you did a great job at that. I think Andy both vocalized some and then just displayed some, and I think you picked up on the vast majority of them. What else did you guys think about in terms of empathy?
I think thought about talking about peer support and different options that we had through insurance carriers and different things, and whether people may take you up on it and
Yeah.
different things. One thing I thought about was the borehole not having been done yet,
Yeah.
and whether the provider was able to or wanting to
Yeah.
do it, and whether they felt.
Yeah, can I pursue that question
Sure,
with you for
yeah.
just a moment? So he expressed some trepidation about going back in and taking care of this patient again and
Right.
drilling that hole, and you immediately sort of took him off the case. Could you talk about that decision?
Right. My first thought was we had a trauma come through the ED a couple months ago, I'm thinking. And we talked about whether the providers were able to continue giving care.
Yeah.
And so that kind of went through my mind, thinking,
I
okay,
see.
if Andy was completely like, I'm just not comfortable doing it,
Yeah.
and it needed to be done fairly soon,
Yeah.
because you said right away,
Yeah.
Andy did. I thought, oh, do I really want to push him into doing that, given the fact that he really is clearly struggling a little bit with it.
Yeah,
And
I
I didn't want to create that.
It was a reasonable decision what you did. It came across to me slightly directive. You know what I mean? Like you had taken control
Instead
away
of
from him.
pursuing it a little more.
That's what I wanted you to do. I wanted
Got
you
it.
to keep exploring it, still with the possibility that once you hear how he feels, you're going to suggest that he not do that.
Okay.
But I thought there might have been a way to have him make that decision and you just endorse
perfect.
it.
Got it. Okay.
Andy, you want to reflect on that, Andy? What was that like for you?
You guys have some fantastic people at your organization, I have to say, just right off the bat. There's so many good things there. One of the interesting thing for me was the flow of the conversation at the beginning. I think we got into an interesting path because you started out, one of the first things you asked was about what's your schedule looking like for the rest of the day? And then it kind of got into sort of, before we even got to any sort of emotions of how I'm feeling, it kind of got into a bit of a processing. Okay, so your schedule's clear, but you will have to talk to the family at some point, and we're going to have to tidy all those things up. And we kind of got through a few minutes without ever having got to just how are you feeling, right? And it was all, and it was still empathetic what you were asking. You know, you're looking out for my schedule, but as I said, at some point in the interview, it felt like, oh, right, we're going to have to make all these. I thought this session was to make me feel better about myself and comfortable rather than figure out all this, scary steps ahead.
Got it. Okay.
And so we did eventually get there.
Yeah.
But
it would have been better on the other end.
I had exactly the same feeling, and what I was saying to myself was, feelings first, feelings first, feelings first.
Yeah.
And I felt it was a failure on my part that I should have put that on the slide. Tim, note to ourselves, I got to put on that slide, feelings first.
Got it.
Deal with the emotions first. The other stuff comes easier to you, comes more naturally to you.
Yeah.
You will eventually be able to deal with the scheduling stuff. Is relatively mundane and relatively straightforward to deal with. The feelings are the primary thing.
Yeah.
So I was totally tuned into the same thing, and it wasn't bad because in talking about his scheduling, it was coming from a place of concern. So it's not like it was off-putting, but I shared the feeling it was like procedural in its feeling.
Yeah.
Maybe you needed to
Weird
warm
order.
up. I mean, what was your having heard this feedback? What is it? How do you react?
No, I think that's completely true. Because my first thought was, okay, care for him and make sure we kind of check the boxes almost to say, okay, schedule, check. Care for him. Emotionally, I want to make sure he's okay caring for other patients. So that was what was in my head when you said, I'm really having a tough time. And so that's right where my head went. But that's great feedback.
I see.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add about how it went? How would you evaluate your performance?
Okay. I would evaluate it okay.
I would say at least above average, wouldn't you, Andy?
Thank you. Very kind. Very kind, Andy. Thank you.
It was. You did a lot of good things. You're naturally an empathetic person, I think, and that came across. I think that the few things that you did, which we gave you feedback about, are easily fixed. And they could have something to do with the anxiety of being up in front of people and things that you could fix easily. Andy, anything else you want to add before we go out to the audience?
It's one turn of phrase you used, be patient with yourself, just really stuck out with me. I really heard that and I was like, oh, that's really interesting,
Because I thought, was that telling you how to feel?
Right, that's what I worried about. As soon as I said it, I thought, oh, gosh darn it.
I thought that was...
That's interesting to what will, so it really worked.
Yeah, but my intent was don't get so hung up on, oh my gosh, I gotta be back on it right away. And
Yeah, I think that this is part of the instinct to fix things, part of the instinct to make it better, to make Andy feel better, all of which comes from a place of altruism, but I think may not be the most effective thing. I think the most effective thing is simply to sit there and keep drawing it out. And just be there with it.
I think if you've, as she already had at that point for me, established like a rapport and a trust that I was there. If coming from a different person, it might have really stuck out like a sore thumb. But because of the relationships we'd already built, I don't know. I give you.
You were convinced she cared about you.
Yeah,
so
I didn't think that had come from like a lazy place. It come from a genuine.
It might have rung hollow or something like that in a different context.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the other faculty people, I would have rated you much higher. I took a lot of other notes. And I can't wait to see the video because you did some awesome reflective listening. Yeah. When he said, I feel guilty, you reflected that back at the perfect time. That rarely happens in these enactments. You also used silence. There were a couple times where it looked like you were about to say things and you allowed there to kind of be silence kind of related to that. Yeah. So I think given your style, and it seemed to work, which is really what we're looking for, I would have put you significantly above average in doing it. I thought you did a really great job. I think the video will bear out that you nailed it in many areas.
There were multiple episodes of reflection, multiple episodes where Andy either said or showed an emotion and you named it. And then you also did another. One of my favorite expressions in this kind of context is tell me more. And that's, you said, yeah, you said the word guilty. Tell me more, which is perfect. And then be quiet. There was one or two occasions where I could see you being quiet, and then you got the best of yourself and started to talk again. I just thought, I must be quiet, let him talk.
Honestly, one of my comments was just going to be, I think I should have used silence more. Yeah. Seriously. So thank you for that.
You did use it some. You could have used it even more.
Yeah.
I think there's a variety of things going on under the spotlights which make you feel like you have to talk or fill the spaces. So let's open up to the audience, your colleagues, to see what they saw and had to say. So raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone.
There's a
over
chat
here.
box over there.
Okay, so you were talking about not offering or trying to fix the problem.
Yeah.
But can you offer like support, like what can I do for you right now? And if they say nothing or I don't even know what you could do to help me, like can you offer those solutions of assistance, or is right now not the best time?
I love the first thing you said, which I don't think Iris ever said, which is, what can I do to help? This sort of open-ended offer of help. I love that. And then if the person responds and says, I don't know, I don't even know what, like what are you empowered to do to help? They sort of don't even know what the options are. Then I think it's okay. And Iris eventually did that. We have EAP, we have more peer support. I could come back and talk to you. I think that's okay. And I don't think that's trying to fix it or make it go away. I think it's clearly within bounds to come in and say, I'm here to help. I want to help. And if they don't know how you can help them, you can list the ways. And in that context, you might say, we might be able to get your schedule cleared. We can get you, if you need longer term support, I can get you other support. If you really need to talk to another surgeon, we can make that happen in a day or so.
But you don't want to promise something you can't deliver.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming, in this case, with Clay being part of the team, he's already given her the green light. We do have the ability to fill in for him. So if that comes up, you're not promising something you can't deliver, because there's nothing worse than she then says, hey, we'll be able to get somebody to cover you. It turns out you don't have anybody to cover.
Yeah.
So that's part of the huddle, is just what you said, what am I empowered to be able to offer him if I ask him, what do you need? So, and that's where you guys probably talked about that, and that was a good thing to be prepared for.
Other questions? I thought I saw at least another hand up or two. So raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone. Here?
So Iris, you did a lovely job.
Yeah.
And I know you just a little bit, and I mean, not well, but I know of your hospital, I know of you, and you're that lovely, I know that.
Nice.
But the point I wanted to make is, although you were sort of apologetic about, I'm not a provider, I'm not a true peer, I think in your hospital, in my hospital, small rural hospitals, we don't have a depth of peer support when it comes to our physician providers. So I think very realistically, it could very well be a scenario like this. And you handled it very lovely. And so the point being, it doesn't have to be another physician. It can be done effectively with a non.
I completely agree. And Iris would be great at it. It probably is great at it in her job. So we just think sort of ideally appear because of all the complex circumstances you might want to be able to relate to. But in a pinch, you just want someone there who's good enough to give a comforting ear and be an empathic presence for someone.
Because we were talking about that at our table in our huddle, you know, because we don't have a lot of depth in provider peers, you could really do a lot of harm by insisting on it be a peer physician, but a very bad one.
Yeah.
You know, and that would be so much worse.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you have like a totally insensitive old school surgeon is just like, get back on the horse, you know, that kind of a guy.
Right. No offense to
tell
my
them
physician friends here.
You got to share the LUMC story, which was our greatest disaster of any workshop.
Tim and I won't name. You use the initials. I won't name it. We were at a health system, and we were doing a training about care for the caregiver, and we spent all morning talking about care for the caregiver. At that point, we were also talking a lot about provider suicide and burnout and all this stuff. And we set up a scenario. Was it Andy? It was Andy doing the acting, and the guy. And they picked. We were trying to get a volunteer, and it was hard to get a volunteer. And they all pointed to this guy. This was like the oldest, most grizzled, tough guy, old school senior surgeon who held a very powerful position both formally and informally in the hospital. And he came up and he basically said, yeah, these feelings are bullshit, aren't they? You know, you just want to get back, excuse my profanity, you know, you just want to get back.
Quote, Bruce. Okay.
It was basically
it
that.
Was
it was like,
he said.
you know, it was, you know, just in my day, you know, we just get back in there. I think the best thing is just get back in there. He said, get back in there maybe about 10 times. He was like, get back on the horse. Just want to get back in there. Just want to, you know, and that's all it was. And Tim and I were just dumbfounded. Like,
we were gobsmacked.
What just happened? Did he not hear the first 3 hours of the seminar we had just given?
Yep.
And not only that, but then we stopped and we did the debriefing, and I was trying not to be confrontational or anything, and no one in the room wanted to confront him because he was this sort of senior guy. And I said, well, you know, what about the burnout and all this? He says, well, I was just at a meeting. All they talked about was burnout. All they talked about was physician suicide. And I just thought to myself, did you attend any of those panels? About burnout physicians? I think that those things really die hard. He was dyed in the wool, old school. It's weakness to ask for help. It's weakness to show your emotion.
Yep.
And he just wouldn't.
So here's the key.
Yeah.
But here's the key to that, as I pass this to you, is the most important person, this is my view, and Heather would share that. Heather Farley, you saw in the video, started up the peer support team at Christiana Care, 2 huge hospitals. She's taken over an amazing job. And she plays this role. You've got to match the peer supporter to the person. That is the most important job, is the triage. Generally, it's proceduralist with proceduralist or what have you, nurse to nurse. But there's sometimes, if I had her, we just did a little bit more, I would have you support everybody. I mean, I really thought that was spectacular. Heat of the moment in front of your colleagues here. But that triage piece is critical. That's where we screwed up at that place. We should have known better. There should have been other people saying, you're not going to do this. This isn't going to go well. Yeah. Oh my gosh. No, it was, and then we're done. And so everybody walks out thinking the best way to provide peer support is just tell them to get back on the horse. And we're just like,
from our point of view, it was like a massive failure. It's like we did not succeed in getting the message
Our
across.
biggest failure in 10 years of training. So seriously, Carol. And I needed peer support, and so did Bruce when we were done.
Carol, and then back over here.
Yeah.
We were talking about at this table is why not ask the provider? You know, do you want a peer or do you want someone else? Like sometimes all we have to do is ask questions, and we'll tell you exactly what we want. And I think it's in the same scenario.
So here's...
I know I'm opening Pandora's box.
No. I'm glad you asked it, because when we first designed our process, and we published this, when we asked the providers, 98% of the time they said, I don't need nothing. Yeah. Because it's a sign of weakness. So we had to flip it and make it proactive. And so our safety risk people would say, you know, our program here, there is going to be somebody who's going to reach out and see how you're doing the rest of it. And in the meantime, if you have other people that you want to chat with about it, we support you doing that. But remember, it's not to talk about the facts or other stuff like that. But we tried it that way, Carol, and our numbers failed. And Heather had the same thing. So that it's gone to be proactive and systematic in terms of doing that.
We would say, who would you like to talk to? And they would say, no one.
Right.
I want to hear your question.
That was going to be my question.
Yeah.
If you have a physician that's like, I'm not talking about it.
No, that we send someone. It's not optional. You can you can sort of be uncooperative, I suppose, once we come to say, but we just say, no, this is something that we do. And I don't know, Tim, that's pretty rare. I think in Christianity,
They never had it happen.
We just don't hear that happening.
They never had it happen where somebody said no. Some were talkative.
Yeah.
Said, okay, fine.
Yeah, I'm
and
good.
It kind of went, okay, I'm
Yeah.
good, I'm fine. It was pretty cursory. The other neat thing about their data is that only 4% of the time did they make the referral to a higher level of support. 96% of the time. The other part, when you think about resources for this, when she trained up her team, for those who are on her team of providing peer support, they averaged 3 to 4 encounters a year. That's all. They had enough people to do it. Each encounter was no more than 30 minutes. So all they asked people, when you think about resources and building this, you only need people to volunteer to do this a little bit of time in terms of doing that. So those were her numbers from that end.
Yes, please.
Great job, Iris. First off, thank you so much. The other thing, we had the advantage of having Carol at our table, and the other point of discussion that we had is, who does the family want to do this procedure? Does the family honestly want Andy to go back in and do that next procedure? And so maybe before we ask Andy, maybe we need to ask the family. I don't really know how to.
Well, so
what do you recommend?
I think this is kind of the right way. I think you'd get to there. If he's absolutely unable to do it, he should have the option of opting out, but needs to tell family that.
Okay.
Because he's in there the first time. If he is interested potentially doing it, that's where he goes out, he has the conversation with the family and says, in the context of knowing what you know now, would you still like me to do the procedure? And I fully would accept the fact that you may not be comfortable with me doing that. And that's how we would coach that conversation.
Okay.
So where you're getting consent, but boy, if he's just not ready to do it, that's, you want to think about, he needs to tell the family, here's what happened, and I just want to let you know, I'm just not in a position where I feel like I can do well by your dad. Marty.
So I was interested in another aspect of this. So it's 5 days after a really horrifying result from the point of view of the kids. And Iris, you were really gentle with him about whether he was ready, but I was listening to you trying to factor in, okay, suppose you've got 2 devoted children who are really, really eager to have a conversation with him. Mm-hmm. How much do you push at this stage to really get him to know that request is out there?
You push hard.
That's the ultimate goal, right?
Yeah.
Get that.
Yeah. Either way, you need to frame it. He has to have a conversation with them at some point. I mean, he has to. For his own well-being, the timing is kind of up to you to kind of figure it out, but he has to have the conversation, Marty, to explain either he is going to be involved in the next case or he's begging off, because he has a doctor-patient relationship, and only through them can that be broken.
But he was begging.
But he needs to talk to the family then, and during that process, explain, they're going to say what happened, he can explain what happened, and then he can say, I'm respectfully telling you, I just don't think I'm the person to do the surgery. And then he can back off. And say, I'd like to introduce you to the person who is in a good position to be able to do that, and then you would do the handover.
Rachel.
I just had a logistical question. How many peer supporters and how many doctors did the example at Christiana?
Yeah.
What's their ratio?
Oh, so it's a huge hospital. It's 700 beds,
okay.
I think. She had 30 trained physicians for the whole system to do it. In the first year, they did 200, I think, interventions in terms of the conversations they had. Go ahead.
Oh, and she assigned?
She would triage. So it would come in, and she would be the one to say, I think this person is probably the best match for that one.
Okay.
And then they did a really neat thing. They did anonymous feedback of how it went. In other words, for privacy reasons, they wouldn't identify who got the support, but the person providing the support would identify themselves and talk about, without identifying who they supported, what went well, what didn't, what suggestions would they have, so she could collect data on that.
If you follow up with us, Rachel, we can probably get you the slides from a talk that Heather gave where she gives more of the detailed data. If you're trying to estimate at U of I, what is it going to take to get a peer support cohort that's going to be able to cover your whole system, it's less than you think.
Yep.
Because thank goodness, although these events are not non-existent, they're relatively rare.
Yep.
And so it's a manageable burden.
The biggest gap she found in training was floor nurses. They trained a bunch of ICU nurses, OB nurses, NICU nurses, because they thought that's where it was going to be. Turned out to be floor nurses who are just working their tails off, running around like crazy. They have huge ratios of patient to nurses. That turned out to be a very stressed out group, and so she needed to. They didn't train any floor nurses initially. They then started training floor nurses as peers. It was fascinating to see.
And they might not have seen that many fatalities, for example, but they had other issues that needed support.
Medication errors that they'd made where they needed support and all that.
How do you choose who?
Can we give you the mic?
How do you choose who is going to be your peer support, or do you wait for volunteers? How do you roll that out?
A really great question. There's two specific ways to think about doing that. One is, you go to the various units and you ask, who are your really empathic colleagues? In other words, you get suggestions, you get almost nominations. Yeah. So like in the OR, the ICU, because they know who's good. And you do it with your physician group too. I'm sure Clay knows, and David knows, who are those empathic docs who are out there who might want to lean in. Then what we do suggest, it's just helpful for feedback, and it's not that hard to do, is to do the communication skills assessment with them. You may find some who are they're the savants, and those are people who you can begin to think about putting in leadership positions. You use everybody that volunteers because it's a great thing, but then you use the ones who do the skills assessment to do that. I think that's probably the most effective way to do it, and that's how Heather would go out and find others. Wow, we need some floor nurses. I'm going to talk to some of those nurse managers, some charge nurses, some VPs of nursing, whatever the thing is, and say, hey, who do you got who's really good? And then you might go through that
Tim, you want to say a word about retired providers as a potential resource in this as well?
Right. So the other group that we're really building some really neat teams with, and we did this as part of our research, is retired nurses and physicians in your community. And what we learned when we did the 7 Pillars grant that we published on, when we did the debriefs, is these docs and nurses who volunteered were part of this were so appreciative. I mean, they get tears in their eyes when they talk about, even though they'd been retired from nursing or medicine for a while, they felt like healers again. So that is another really great group where you can go to the leadership of your medical staff and say, hey, who's retired recently, who we might be able to reach out and do this, and it just builds community. It's a really, really cool way to do that. So that's one of the other ways, is look at because they never got this support, and boy, they feel like, wow, boy, if we could do things a little bit different, I would love to be part of one of these teams and do that part.
And then what does the training look like?
Like this.
This is it,
You just saw it.
yeah.
It's like this.
Yeah.
And then there's even more specific stuff around boundaries. Where can you go? That's a big part of the conversation, is boundaries and so we would do a full 8-hour training just for peer support. Then you do periodic booster. Then you meet every quarter to debrief. Hey, this is what happened. What went well? What didn't went well? And I'd be wondering, how many of you have Schwartz rounds? So nobody here has had Schwartz rounds.
It's a kind of rounds based on ethics and...
Yeah, so it's if you look it up, it's a big program in a lot of organizations where they bring emotional, ethical issues into a forum where a lot of people are invited to. It's like a lunch and learn, and you talk about this kind of stuff. You talk about stress and burnout and peer support. You talk about all these kind of difficult things, and it's very structured and it's very facilitated, and most people find it to be a great service, a great support. People found it very valuable, and just kind of anchors the organization into what this is all about, and that sometimes is part of the training as well. SCHWARTZ.
Schwartz. Like the name Schwartz.
Schwartz rounds. So if you look that up, you'll see it and go, oh wow, now I know.
It's a tradition. We have it at Northwestern. I think I had it at U of I.
Oh yeah. Yep. Loyola has it. University of California.
Maybe time for one more question. Then I think Tim wants to talk about resolution. Then we want to move on to another observation or question about empathy. All right, then let's give Iris one more round of applause, and Andy as well.
That was really great. Really great. All right, Bruce, do you have the slide of answer? Awesome. Slides up. All right, so we did the enactment, we did the debrief. That was amazing. We already had lunch. So now we're getting into a bit of the event review. So let's just talk about as it relates to preventing this in the future, automatically think about, besides some of the things, any other thing you want to get out there on the table right now. If we had a flip chart, we put it out there, but you can write it down in your thing. What would you change right away in your organization to prevent another fire? What would be your top priority of all the things we talked about? What's that?
Around the DuraPrep.
Around the DuraPrep, and what are some of the things you would do that would kind of hardwire it, that change? Case cards, making sure if it's head and neck, you're only getting 6 cc's, period, end of discussion. Have an immediate huddle with everybody in the OR the next day to say, here's what we're doing. Absolutely right away, because you cannot put yourself in a position to have another fire. So I would totally agree with that. What else might you do?
Can you get rid of DuraPrep? Is that not an option?
I mean, well, some people did. We'll talk about that in a minute. I mean, that's an option, but I worry about surgical site infections. It really helped reducing that. So, other things you might do immediately.
Education.
Timeout to do, and how would you modify the timeout?
At fire safety.
Absolutely. Risk assessment. So, fire risk assessment. Make it part of every single one of the timeouts now in a quick and easy way that's part of the checklist that didn't exist. Other stuff. Yeah, really start to do that peel back on materials management, need to have conversations, all that other stuff related to that. How they procure stuff, what's in there. What else? You were about to say something.
I was just going to say, probably with the timeout piece, having somewhere where documenting that dry time, it actually gave the effective amount or recommended on the package, the dry time.
Right. Yeah. So part of it is going to be making sure the process is really clear and how do you drive that piece. You could have documentation. I often worry about documentation because sometimes with the electronic record doing that, I'm not saying we actually lie, but sometimes we just do things automatic. You know, check, check, check. So you do need to hardwire the process so people realize why it's so important, and they could do it in a natural way to begin to do that. Part of it is driving the documentation so you can, because you're going to want to go back and audit the changes, because that's the other piece about really significant changes is, can you measure? Is it a SMART goal? In other words, can you really measure it and see, have we made a difference? Are we using this with timeouts now? You might have little spies in there, right, to see, are they really doing a fire assessment with this? You may check case cards to make sure there isn't anything in a head and neck case bigger than 6 cc's. Yeah?
I think there probably needs to be some sort of briefing or something between the anesthesiologist and the surgeon.
Totally agree. Yep.
Like during that timeout.
Yep.
Hey, this is what we got going on.
Yep.
I'm kind of surprised. I'm not an OR nurse. I don't work in the OR, so I never have. So I'm surprised that isn't happening.
Yep. Well, it wasn't then.
Right.
I'm going to show you that it kind of is now based on some of the changes you're suggesting. So yours is a really super good thought. Yeah.
I think we'd actually spend some time articulating the story. So we'd want to share this story to make it real for our staff in terms of why we're doing this, and then have a plan in place to keep that story alive, you know, with the next group of hires. And
so who would you use to tell the story?
I would probably approach the family at the time that they're ready.
Where's Carol? Can you get our big, absolutely, totally agree with that. Because it's one thing to have me sit up here and talk about doing this stuff. It's another if you had these kids come up and have a meeting with the people in the hospital and the ORs and the other places to say, look, let me tell you a story. And if with their permission, what you could do is videotape it. Because one is sustainability, how when new hires come on, have them view 10 minutes of this family telling this story, boom, it sticks home. It's not just another LMS module doing the rest of it. I love that. We are very big into narratives and stories and videotaping it and doing that. I think that's a great, great idea for doing it. Yes. Well, because they feel like you said, Carol, this didn't go in vain. This didn't go in vain. There's actually learning coming from this thing where you could see how freaked out they were in the beginning part, confused and bewildered and shocked.
And I think it shows people coming into your system that this is how you do things, and that patients and families are part of the team, and when mistakes like this happen, that you fix and work with them. It speaks volumes to who you are as a culture.
Yep, totally agree. So, any rate, this is from the workshop 2. These are strong actions that have been shown to create positive peace. And part of this is simplifying the process, standardizing the process. This involvement by leadership is getting the story, telling the story, making the videotape, getting that out there. And then this sort of new device with usability testing is really more new product, where we're going to look into all kinds of strong actions that you'd be able to do that part. In the intermediate piece, again, you've got this. You've got to change that checklist. You've got to have it include the fire assessment. And again, this standardized communication is what she's talking about with, don't the anesthesiologists and surgeons actually talk about what it is that's going on? That's this piece here. And then you mentioned the documentation part, which is, we've got to make sure that the drying time, the prep time is right. So we need to be able to do that. And that's a redundancy, again, that you want to put in the system, to be able to do that. These are the weak actions, and this is why those warnings and labels and signs, they just become part of the wallpaper. And so it is, as much as it may relieve them of a little bit of liability, in this case it doesn't, because of what the drug rep, or the product rep, I guess, had here doing that. But what really doesn't work is punishing people. And let's study it some more, which a lot of people want to do. So in this case, here is the AORN checklist from June of 2016. Right up here, this is the fire risk assessment and discussion, and the prevention methods would be the things like, if we're going to be on nasal oxygen, do we really have to be it, and how do we make it shut off when the cautery goes on, and all that stuff. So AORN put this out right away in terms of doing this piece of it. You also have the anesthesia people talking about, do we have additional concerns here? Had that come up, the anesthesiologist said, we're not doing this under general anesthesia because of the aortic stenosis. We're doing it under sedation. It would have come up and been driven at that point as well. So this is the new checklist that was out just a couple years ago that modified the WHO checklist that's there. And then as promised, I would show you this piece. So this came from the fire marshal in Nebraska who banned the use of DuraPrep, Bruce. So that was their decision, is that they may not use this. And they talked to CMS and the rest of it and said, look, there's just too many fires going on. We haven't figured this out. We have this unintended consequence, and it's a big deal related to it. So, can anybody else think of examples where complications occurred when we put new quality improvement things in place? Things driven by Joint Commission, other places out there. Can you think of other things where they set this standard, then, oh my gosh, boy, did we have some unintended consequences? I can think of several.
Medication reconciliation.
Oh my God, the first one on the list. Survey says. Absolutely. I will tell you, and Carol, I don't mean this facetiously when I bring this up, but I think it's really important. I can think of 3 or 4 patients who died, who were killed at the University of Illinois when we did MedRec. Because of MedRec. And here's how it would happen. Everybody was told they had to give a patient or the family a medication list when they left. Nothing said about it being accurate. They just have to, no, they didn't. When they came in your hospital, they never looked for the accuracy. They just wanted to see, did you give them a list? So we had dermatologists, don't know squat about blood pressure medication, anticoagulants, the rest of that, would give them a list and happen to leave off the antihypertensives. The family now thinks this is our new list. They stop taking the antihypertensives. They come into the ED, stroked, and die. That happened. I can't believe there has not been a huge action related to that sort of stuff, the unintended consequence of doing that. Huge, so I totally agree. Something else very recently that's come out that might be on this list. Michelle.
I was thinking about the whole change in mindset around VBACs.
So you got VBACs as well. So that may be one of the other unintended pieces you have there. Anything else that's really been in the press?
Electronic medical records.
Electronic records. So what were some of the unintended consequences? Bruce Lambert, related to things like having more than one chart open at a time.
Yeah, that's a complicated one, but basically wrong patient errors, are really common because they have multiple charts open. It's not clear, what causes that. But then there's multiple unintended consequences. So at first we were pretty sure that having more than one chart open increased the risk of wrong patient errors. A friend of mine at Columbia, I was part of this paper too, we just did a randomized trial. And so first of all, the Joint Commission then said, recommended but didn't mandate, but most people followed it, you should limit people. So in your hospitals, how many records are you allowed to have open at one time? 2.
Here's 5.
Sometimes Sometimes in the ED they allow them more, but a lot of hospitals cut back to 1 or 2 at the most, which caused a tremendous amount of nuisance. Now it turns out it doesn't appear to make any difference, or at least it's much more complicated than it initially seemed. Having multiple tabs open, though, does seem to in some way be related to the risk of wrong patient
What's
errors.
the other unintended consequence of electronic health records is the famous, infamous, well, there's that piece, but it's copy and paste. So I can tell you, copy and paste is a huge issue. I still remember a case that we had where we really hurt a patient, and when we went back to look at the record, it was just devastatingly bad because the intern had copy and pasted the same note 5 days in a row on a patient who needed much more vigilance than that. But the problem was, I have yet to find a patient survive for 5 days. A temperature of 112.5. I've never seen that, but that's what the record said 5 days in a row. So when you bring it forward, the data is very clear that you're bringing forward a lot of mistakes. One other major issue that's out there, huge in the press, everywhere in the press, it's one of our biggest epidemics right now, was, and many people believe, and there's a great book I highly recommend called Dreamland, because boy does it drive it home. And what I'm fishing for is making pain the 5th vital sign. And the fact that a pain of 1 is unacceptable and we need to get pain to 0. And there are many people, and this book really clearly articulates that that is what has led to the opiate crisis. Because you saw this massive increase of everybody feeling like they needed to give people opiates right away and get that pain score to 0. Joint Commission would come in and say how to do that. So these are huge issues that have come up that are the unintended consequences. This fire thing is just another amazing example. Yeah.
I was just going to say on the pain issue, now the pendulum didn't stop midway. It swung completely the other way around. So now I'm driving heroin overdoses because I can't prescribe. This is a devastating thing in our careers right now.
Right. And so the other thing, Marty, do you want to share a little bit what we learned about the physical and verbal abuse that's going on out there? And in part, it's due to this feeling like, oh my gosh, we're trapped between a rock and a hard place of how we take care, we manage some of these people. Marty was with me in a system we won't name, but that it was super powerful and drove home what you said.
Yeah, it's actually, there's multiple hard places and bad spots, but yeah, the thing Tim is talking about is actually just the increasing aggressiveness of patients who show up and sometimes interface, first of all, with an administrator, really with abusive behavior, or not just verbally abusive, but other kinds of fear in terms of them putting together not only their need for medicines, but also their understanding that systems get ranked now on how satisfied the customer is, and really using that as leverage going in with really threatening ideas. The other one that I wanted to mention that I just heard at a CMS meeting is just the way in which the system has geared up now to try to treat people who are drug seekers, but not so much treating people who got physically addicted to a big painkiller because of an accident or something like that, but just have to get off on the right schedule. Just huge training gap, and doctors understanding how people need to get off of a really, really high dose of painkillers for a long period of time.
Yep. But I totally agree. We are in a very tough place right now. And that's why when you think about these improvements and changes, always need to have somebody who's really pondering what are the unintended consequences of what we're about to do. And I think it's just a critical part when we do this part of the Candor process. So the other piece, that we get into that is, as you learn more, you share more while obtaining consent. So we are going to, begin to think about doing that enactment, that's going to come up after the break. And so one of the things that we want to get into is this whole idea around financial and non-financial, compensation. Just going to bring up a few slides again, another example of sort of doing that. As you can see here, you've heard it many times about offering compensation when it's appropriate early on. There are some risks associated with it. As we've talked about before, there's some old school risk managers and some defense lawyers who completely freak out with this stuff. And you just need to be aware of that in terms of their real fears of what they have from that standpoint. But it's very tough. And when you think about empathy, one of the trickiest things is how do you empathically begin to have a conversation about money? And part of it that we've learned very early on is to acknowledge that up front with statements like, you know, no amount of money, we understand no amount of money is going to take away the pain or the disfigurement that your dad had. You know, we understand that, but we do believe that you have suffered costs related to the pain and the suffering, the other medical care that we are accountable for, we're responsible for. And we need to begin to think about that and have that conversation. One of the other pieces is how do you manage the medical bills, and then some of the other types of issues you can see up here, which may not be part of the case we're discussing because the patient wasn't, you know, lost wages or any other sort of stuff like that. So again, these are all questions that are worth thinking about. You know, how has it affected their daily living? A lot of other anticipating out-of-pocket expenses, and again, thinking about the pain and suffering they may have gone for, and then their expenses related for medical care related to this. This is what Marty talked about at the last workshop. This he pulled out of his wallet. So what we had created at the University of Illinois, and we used for this fire case, was after the patient was stabilized and upstairs, we gave the family, this is the front of the card, and this is the back of the card, saying to them, heretofore, when you come back to the clinic or you need to come back for a procedure, you need to present this card. We're going to have a system in place to recognize you, but just in case, present this card because this will ensure that we are the guarantor of what it is, the care you're going through, not your insurance company per se, not anybody else. We're going to deal with the Medicare issue because we need to communicate them about the mistake and what we're doing. But this was really, really valuable in our cases. What's one of the values of using this kind of card, sharing it with them and encouraging them to come back? And I'm really now, what's that? It's tangible. You're giving them something. That's right. You're giving them something. It also says patient safety on it. What else is really valuable? I'm going to have a word. Yes. So as Dar just said, it helps ensure that they're going to come back to you, because that way you can control those costs versus them going to some other organization, another part doing that. So you're maintaining contact with them. We're able to follow it and track it and do all that sort of piece of it. So this was hugely valuable, way that we did it. And the other part it allowed us to do was to track the costs associated with the medical care of these medical mistakes. So this case went into kind of the bucket, the attributing parts of the organization, including nursing, hospital because of materials management, neurosurgery because of their participation in anesthesia. And so all of the costs associated with his ongoing care were apportioned to those groups. And at the end of the year, you'd have this really neat accounting thing to see how much free care did dermatology, plastic surgery, and others do to this case where they weren't part of creating the problem. So it created this really cool sense of accountability and peer review in front of the docs, because they all saw, here are our 12 events that happened in the last year. Here are the people who provided care and didn't bill for it. And here are where we found the attributing causes to it. It was really amazing to look at the way to create this kind of financial accountability for doing that by having this piece put into place. So it was pretty nifty in terms of doing that. So that is one of the things that you want to think about when you pull this piece forward. So non-financial forms of resolution. Carol, you want to talk a little bit about this? Can somebody throw you the chat box? Because I know you've published on this. It's in AHRQ and others, but this is where I think you're the expert really in this group for this.
So often you think we want monetary compensation, but a lot of times we don't want the money. What we may want is the education around it. A grand rounds in their name, to sit on a certain board. Maybe for some they can't go back to the organization, but they want a bench somewhere with the memory of their family member. So realize everything is not monetary, and then again, it depends on the kind of situation. If it's someone who has to have care for the rest of their lives, then that seems very reasonable. But so many others, they don't want a dime. Or the other thing is, if they do, they often will partner with different organizations or even that organization to say, we'll take this money and we'll work with you to do different things. So there's a lot of different ways that people want something, but again, it's not always give me $1 million kind of scenario.
Yeah. Thanks, Carol, for that. And I've seen many examples of what it is that she mentioned in terms of what families really, want to be able to take away from this. So I just think it's a really good thing to ponder. So what I want to do now is, why don't we take the break now? We'll come back. Stretch your legs, take the break. We'll come back shortly after 2:30. Then what we're going to do is the final enactment with the family, which will include that time, as you saw at the last workshop, getting their consent to engage in the Candor conversation. They will have their lawyer with them, like we did the last time, which actually is going to make it very easy for you. Because the lawyer gets this, appreciates this, they're wanting to be there. You shouldn't get a lot of fight with that. But think about how you're going to get that consent and then move into the conversation to explain. Remember, no one's really fully explained to them all what happened now, or all the stuff that you've done to try to prevent it in the future. The brilliant way, Dar, I think you did at the last workshop, weren't you the one who shared all the things that were going to be done to prevent the air embolism? So the same way here, think about, for those of you who may volunteer to go up and have this, if you want to redo it, we'll redo the list again after the break, but all the things you're going to be able to share with the family, as well as empathically begin to talk to them about kind of some of the financial pieces that you want to then begin to ease into. Does that make sense? Any questions before the break? All right, so why don't we take 15, regroup after the break, and we will see how it goes.